A single lottery ticket transformed an ordinary woman into a millionaire overnight. But instead of celebrating, she chose to keep it secret, testing her family with a fabricated cry for help. When her loved ones revealed their true faces, she decided to orchestrate a revenge that would leave the entire family speechless. Who would stand by her side? Who would be exposed? And what price would they pay for their betrayal? My name is Rachel Monroe, and until 3 days ago, I was just another 36-year-old woman drowning in the quicksand of middle-class financial anxiety in Cleveland, Ohio. Every morning, I'd drag myself to my cubicle at EverTrust Mutual Insurance, where I processed claims for people whose lives had been turned upside down by accidents, illnesses, and disasters. The irony wasn't lost on me. I spent my days calculating other people's misfortunes while my own life was steadily unraveling. My studio apartment on the east side was a testament to making do with less. The radiator clanged like a dying animal every night. The bathroom faucet dripped incessantly, and the neighbors upstairs seemed to practice interpretive dance at 2 in the morning. But it was what I could afford after rent, utilities, groceries, and the minimum payments on 4 maxed-out credit cards that followed me around like hungry vultures. The credit card debt was my own personal hell, $18,000 spread across plastic rectangles that had once promised freedom, but now felt like shackles. Every swipe at the grocery store was accompanied by a silent prayer that the card wouldn't be declined. I'd mastered the art of grocery shopping with a calculator, putting back items when the total crept too high, always choosing generic brands and wondering if this was what my life would always be. My birthday fell on a Tuesday this year, which felt appropriate for someone whose life had become a series of unremarkable Tuesdays. I'd developed a small ritual over the years, buying a single lottery ticket on my birthday, not because I believed in luck, but because for $2, I could spend a few minutes imagining a different life. It was cheaper than therapy and lasted longer than a cup of coffee. That evening, I stopped at the corner store where Mr. Patel always remembered to ask about my day, even though my answer was invariably, fine. I handed him 2 crumpled bills and pointed to the Powerball machine. "Birthday ticket," he asked with a knowing smile. "Birthday ticket," I confirmed, taking the small piece of paper that held my annual dose of hope. I tucked it into my wallet and forgot about it, the way you forget about most small rituals that pepper ordinary days. I went home, heated up leftover Chinese takeout, and fell asleep watching a Netflix show I'd already seen 3 times because I couldn't afford premium channels. 2 days later, I was sitting in my car during lunch break, scrolling through my phone and avoiding the stack of insurance claims waiting on my desk. When I remembered the ticket, I pulled it from my wallet, more out of boredom than expectation, and opened the lottery app to check the numbers. The first number matched, then the second. My heart started beating faster. The third, fourth, fifth, all matching. I stared at the screen, convinced I was reading it wrong. I checked again, then again, my hands beginning to shake. $1.4 million, after taxes. I sat in my Honda Civic, surrounded by the parking lot of a strip mall, holding a piece of paper worth more money than I'd ever imagined having. The world continued around me, people walking to their cars, a mother pushing a stroller, teenagers laughing, but everything felt surreal, like I was watching life through thick glass. My first instinct wasn't joy, it was terror. Because I knew my family. I knew that the moment they discovered I had money, I wouldn't have money anymore. I'd become their personal ATM, their solution to every financial problem, their backup plan for every poor decision. The pattern was already established. They came to me when they needed something, disappeared when they didn't, and somehow always made me feel guilty for not giving more. Sitting in that parking lot, clutching my lottery ticket, I realized I had a choice. I could tell them and watch the money disappear into their endless pit of wants and needs, or I could keep quiet and finally, for once in my life, have some control over my own destiny. The decision made itself. The terror I felt wasn't irrational, it was learned. My family had trained me well over the years, teaching me that my value was directly proportional to my usefulness, and my usefulness was measured in dollars. My mother, Sylvia, had perfected the art of emotional manipulation wrapped in maternal concern. 3 years ago, she called me crying about how the roof was leaking and she couldn't afford repairs. I scraped together $2,000 I didn't have, putting it on a credit card that's still haunting me today. 2 weeks later, I saw her Facebook photos from a wine tour in Napa Valley. When I confronted her, she said the roof could wait. She needed this trip for her mental health. The roof, apparently, was fine. It had been a small stain from a potted plant upstairs. My older brother Mark was a different kind of vampire. He'd mastered the crisis call always at night, always urgent, always involving someone who might get hurt if he didn't get money immediately. Last year, it was his girlfriend's medical bills. The year before, his car breaking down when he was stranded 2 hours away. Each time, I'd wire him $300 or $400, money I couldn't afford but sent anyway because he was family, and family helps family. Right. I later learned from his ex-girlfriend that there were no medical bills. She dumped him when she found out he'd been using her fictional illness to fund his weekend gambling trips to the casino. The broken-down car was usually him too drunk to drive home, needing an Uber and drinks for the next night out. Then there was Clara, my younger sister, whose wedding 3 years ago became my financial nightmare. She begged me to be her maid of honor, which I was thrilled about until I realized she expected me to fund half the celebration. The dress, the bachelorette party, the shower, the emergency funds when the caterer demanded a larger deposit, it all came out of my pocket. $4,000 I borrowed against my 401k, money I'm still paying back with interest and penalties. Clara promised she'd pay me back after the honeymoon. That was 3 years ago. She's had 2 beach vacations since then and just bought a new SUV. But somehow there's never money to repay her sister who went into debt to make her wedding dreams come true. My father, Douglas, was perhaps the worst of all because he cloaked his indifference in righteousness. He'd lecture me about fiscal responsibility while refusing to help with any real problems. When my car broke down and I needed $800 for repairs to get to work, he spent 20 minutes on the phone explaining how this was a learning opportunity for me to build character. This from a man who spent more than that on golf equipment every few months. Each family gathering became a performance where I pretended their behavior didn't hurt, where I smiled and nodded while they talked about their purchases, their trips, their plans, all funded by money they somehow always had for themselves, but never for helping others. I'd sit at dinner tables, listening to them complain about their minor inconveniences while still making payments on debts I'd incurred helping them with their emergencies. But there was one exception, one bright spot in this gallery of disappointment, my Aunt Helen. Helen was my father's sister, the family member everyone else seemed to barely tolerate. She wasn't flashy or dramatic. She didn't post her life on social media or throw elaborate parties. She worked as a librarian, lived in a small house she'd paid off decades ago, and somehow always appeared when I actually needed help. When I had food poisoning last winter and couldn't leave my apartment for 3 days, Helen showed up with homemade soup and groceries. When my laptop died and I couldn't afford a new one, she quietly gave me her old one, claiming she'd upgrade it anyway. She never made a big deal of these gestures, never held them over my head, never expected anything in return. Helen was the one who noticed when I looked tired, who asked real questions about my life and actually listened to the answers. She was the one who remembered my birthday without Facebook reminders and sent thoughtful cards instead of last-minute gift cards. In a family that measured love in transactions, Helen was the only one who gave freely. The contrast was stark and painful. My immediate family treated me like a resource to be mined when needed and ignored when not. Helen treated me like a person worth caring about, regardless of what I could provide. Sitting in my car with that lottery ticket, these memories flooded back with crystalline clarity. I realized that my terror wasn't just about losing the money, it was about losing myself again to their endless demands, their assumption that my purpose was to solve their problems while they remained oblivious to mine. For the first time in my adult life, I had real power. The question was, what was I going to do with it? The first thing I did was nothing. For 48 hours, I carried on with my normal life, going to work, eating microwave dinners, and pretending that a small piece of paper in my wallet hadn't changed everything. But beneath the surface, my mind was racing, calculating, planning. I needed professional help, and I needed anonymity. On Friday afternoon, I called in sick to work and drove downtown to the offices of Hartwell and Associates, a law firm that specialized in financial planning for lottery winners. I'd found them through careful internet research during my lunch breaks, reading about their discretion and expertise in handling sudden wealth. Margaret Hartwell was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and kind eyes that had probably seen every human reaction to sudden money. She listened without judgment as I explained my situation, not just the lottery win, but my family dynamics, my fears, my need for secrecy. "You're not the first person to sit in that chair with these concerns," she said, leaning back in her leather chair. "Family and money can be a toxic combination. The good news is, we can structure this to protect both your assets and your privacy." Within 2 hours, we'd established an anonymous trust. The money would be managed by the law firm, accessible to me through various mechanisms that would leave no obvious paper trail back to Rachel Monroe, struggling insurance adjuster. To the outside world, I would remain exactly who I'd always been. "The key," Margaret explained, "is that you control the narrative. You decide when, how, and if anyone ever learns about this windfall." Walking out of that office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine power. Not the illusion of control that comes from managing crisis to crisis, but real, substantial power to shape my own life. But power without purpose is just potential energy. I needed a plan. That weekend, I sat in my cramped apartment, surrounded by legal documents and the weight of possibility. I could disappear, start fresh somewhere else, leave Cleveland and my family behind. I could continue my current life, secretly comfortable while maintaining the facade of struggle. Or I could do something that had been building in my mind since I first saw those lottery numbers. I could test them. The idea crystallized slowly, like a photograph developing in solution. My family had shown me who they were through years of taking and disappointment, but I'd never given them a clear, definitive test. I'd never created a situation where their true nature would be undeniably revealed. What if I needed help, real help, urgent help, the kind of help that would require sacrifice from them? What if their sister, their daughter, their family member was facing a genuine crisis? The scenario wrote itself with disturbing ease. EverTrust Mutual was a small enough company that financial troubles wouldn't be unbelievable. I could claim the company was going under, that layoffs were imminent, that I was about to lose my job and couldn't make rent. I could need exactly $5,000 enough to be significant, not enough to be impossible for people who claimed to love me. $5,000, that would be my test. It was perfect in its simplicity. Anyone who truly cared about me could find $5,000 if they really tried. My mother and her new husband had money they'd just bought a vacation home. Mark always seemed to have funds for his escapades. Clara and her husband Paul had just bought that new SUV. My father had his golf trips and investment accounts. $5,000 to help their family member avoid homelessness. I spent Sunday crafting the story, making it believable but not too complex. EverTrust Mutual was struggling. This part was actually true. The company hadn't been doing well for months. It wouldn't be hard to convince them that my job was in jeopardy. I'd say I needed first month's rent and deposit for a cheaper apartment, plus money to survive while job hunting. Urgent need, clear timeline, specific amount. The beautiful cruelty of it was that I'd be testing them with money I no longer needed, measuring their love with a currency I now possessed in abundance. I'd finally have objective proof of what I'd always suspected but could never quite admit to myself. Monday morning, I called Margaret Hartwell to discuss the logistics of my test. She listened with the same professional calm she'd shown during our first meeting. "You're sure about this approach?" she asked. "Once you do this, there's no going back. You'll know exactly where you stand with each of them." "That's exactly what I want," I replied. I need to know. All right then. Just remember sometimes the truth is more painful than uncertainty, but it's also more liberating. That evening, I sat on my couch, phone in hand, ready to make the first call. My family was about to take a test they didn't know they were taking, and I was about to get answers to questions I'd been afraid to ask for years. The only question remaining was who would I call first. I decided to start with my mother. If anyone would help, it should be her. Right. The woman who gave birth to me, who'd always claimed that family comes first, who'd spent years asking for my help whenever she needed it. I called her Tuesday evening at 7:30, when I knew she'd be home from her book club, but before her nightly wine routine made her too scattered to focus. Rachel, honey. Her voice was bright and cheerful. What a nice surprise. I was just telling Margaret about your job at the insurance company. I took a deep breath. Mom, I need to talk to you about something serious. I'm in trouble. The shift in her tone was immediate. Oh no, what's wrong? Are you sick? No, it's financial. EverTrust Mutual is going under. They're laying people off left and right, and I'm probably going to lose my job within the next 2 weeks. Oh, sweetheart, that's terrible, but you'll find something else. You always do. Mom, I can't make rent. My landlord is already threatening eviction because I was late last month. I need $5,000 to get into a cheaper place and survive while I look for work. I don't have anyone else to ask. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. 5,000. Her voice had changed, become careful, distant. Honey, that's a lot of money. I know it is, but I'm desperate. I might be homeless by the end of the month. Another pause. Well, you know Richard and I just bought the cottage in Lake Erie. We've put everything into that property. And with the market being so uncertain... Mom, I'm about to be homeless. Have you tried those payday loan places? Or maybe you could get another credit card. My chest tightened. I've maxed out my credit cards helping you guys over the years. Remember the roof Clara's wedding? I don't have any credit left. Rachel, I really wish I could help, but the timing is just awful. Maybe you could ask Mark or your father. The conversation limped along for another few minutes before I ended it, feeling hollowed out. Not only had she refused to help, but she'd actively suggested I burden myself with predatory loans rather than ask her to postpone decorating her vacation home. Wednesday evening, I called my father, Douglas Monroe, the man who'd lectured me about fiscal responsibility my entire life. Rachel, good to hear from you. How's work? Actually, Dad, that's why I'm calling. EverTrust is failing. I'm about to lose my job and I'm facing eviction. I need help. I gave him the same story, the same urgent timeline, the same specific request for $5,000. His response was swift and cold. How did you let yourself get into this position I've been telling you for years that you need to save money? Build an emergency fund. This is exactly why financial planning matters. Dad, I need help, not a lecture. This is help. Rachel, the best help I can give you is to let you learn from this mistake. If I bail you out now, you'll never develop the discipline you need to manage money properly. I could be on the street. There are shelters. There are government programs. This might be exactly what you need to motivate yourself to make better choices. I hung up feeling nauseous. My own father would rather see me homeless than help me, all wrapped up in sanctimonious lessons about character building. Thursday. I tried Mark. My call went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation. He didn't call back. I tried again Friday. Same result. By Saturday. It was clear that my brother was actively avoiding me. When I really needed him, he'd simply vanished. Sunday evening, I called Clara, my younger sister, the one whose wedding had cost me thousands. She answered on the second ring, sounding harried. Rachel, how are you? I'm so stressed about the kitchen renovation. The contractor says we need to upgrade the electrical, and it's going to cost way more than... Clara, I'm in trouble. I need your help. I told her the story. Unlike the others, she at least sounded sympathetic. making appropriate worried noises and asking concerned questions. "Oh God, Rachel, that's horrible. 5,000. Let me talk to Paul about it. Maybe we can work something out." For a moment, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe Clara had learned something about gratitude, about reciprocity. She called back 2 hours later. "I talked to Paul," she said, her voice smaller than before. "He says we just can't do it right now, with the renovation and the new car payments. He reminded me that we're still paying off our own credit cards from the wedding. I'm so sorry. Rachel, I really wish I could help." "Clara, you spent more than $5,000 on your bachelorette party alone. Money that I gave you." "That was different. That was for my wedding. This is just life. You know Paul says you need to figure it out yourself. Maybe you could move back in with Mom and Dad temporarily." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. The money I'd borrowed against my retirement to fund her dream wedding was different, but my potential homelessness was just life. By Monday evening, I'd heard from everyone in my immediate family. The score was brutal 0 for 4. Not one of them had offered to help. Not one had even suggested a payment plan or partial assistance. They'd all found reasons why my crisis wasn't their problem, why their wants were more important than my basic needs. But there was one call left to make. Tuesday evening, I dialed Aunt Helen's number with trembling fingers. "Rachel, dear, what a lovely surprise. I was just thinking about you." When I told her about my situation, she didn't hesitate. "Of course I'll help you. I have about $4,700 in my savings account. You can have it all. And honey, you can stay in my spare room for as long as you need. Don't you worry about a thing." I started crying and couldn't stop. Not because I needed her help, I was secretly a millionaire, but because in a family full of people who claimed to love me, only one person had actually proven it. After I hung up with Aunt Helen, I sat in my apartment for hours, staring at the wall where a water stain had been growing for months. The silence felt different now, not the familiar quiet of loneliness, but the heavy stillness that comes after a revelation so profound it changes the molecular structure of your understanding. My family had failed me completely, not partially, not with excuses that held some thread of validity, but utterly and without ambiguity. When I genuinely needed help, or when they believed I genuinely needed help, every single one of them had found reasons to prioritize their own comfort over my survival. But the rage that filled me wasn't the hot, impulsive anger that flares and dies. This was something colder, more methodical. This was the kind of fury that crystallizes into purpose, that transforms hurt into action. For years, I'd been their safety net, their emergency fund, their reliable source of bailout money. When they needed help, I was family. When I needed help, I was an inconvenience. They'd made their choice. Now I would make mine. I called Margaret Hartwell first thing Wednesday morning. "I need to accelerate our timeline," I told her. "I want to set up something more active with the trust funds." "What did you have in mind?" "I want to use some of the money, not for myself, but for a project. Can you arrange for payments to come from the trust without revealing my identity?" "Certainly. Anonymous charitable giving is quite common. What kind of project?" I paused, the words forming even as I spoke them. "I want to teach some people about the real cost of their choices, and I want to reward someone who deserves it." Margaret's voice carried a note of amused understanding. "Ah, your family took the test, I assume. They failed, spectacularly. And now you want to move to the next phase." "Exactly." Over the next several days, I found myself operating with a clarity I'd never experienced before. The constant background anxiety about money, about survival, about disappointing people, all of it had vanished. I was no longer reactive, scrambling to manage crisis after crisis. I was proactive, strategic, in control. I started watching my family with different eyes. At Clara's birthday dinner that weekend, I sat quietly as they discussed their various purchases and plans. Mark talked about his new motorcycle. Clara and Paul showed pictures of their kitchen renovation. My mother gushed about the furniture she was buying for the lake house. My father complained about the cost of his golf club membership going up, but then mentioned the trip to Scotland he was planning. They all had money for their wants. They all had money for their luxuries. They just hadn't had money for my needs. The cruelest part was how easily they'd moved on from my crisis. Not one of them asked how I was managing, whether I'd found the money elsewhere, if I was still facing eviction. My desperate situation had been forgotten as quickly as yesterday's weather forecast. It was as if my call for help had never happened. But I noticed something else during that dinner. The way they talked about money, about opportunities, about investments. Mark mentioned hearing about some insider trading tip from a friend. Clara complained about how slowly their savings were growing. My mother talked about wanting to invest their cash somewhere with better returns than their savings account. They were all hungry for easy money, quick gains, the kind of financial shortcut that appeals to people who spend more than they save. And suddenly, I knew exactly how to proceed. Sitting at that table, watching them prioritize appetizers that cost more than the help they'd refused me, a plan began forming in my mind. It was elegant in its simplicity, poetic in its justice. They'd shown me that our relationship was purely transactional, that they valued me only as a resource to be exploited when convenient. Well, I could be transactional too. I started researching investment scams, Ponzi schemes, and get-rich-quick cons, not to actually steal from people, but to understand the psychology, the promises that make smart people do stupid things. I read about Bernie Madoff, about pump-and-dump schemes, about cryptocurrency frauds. I studied the language they used, the guarantees they made, the way they created urgency and exclusivity. By the following weekend, I had the framework of my revenge. It would be a gift, really a chance for my family to learn the same lesson they'd tried to teach me. They'd shown me that I couldn't count on them when I needed help. Now I would show them what it felt like to need help from someone who didn't care about their problems. The beauty of it was that they would do it to themselves. I wouldn't have to lie or steal or break any laws. I would simply offer them what they wanted most: easy money, and let their own greed and selfishness destroy them. Margaret helped me set up the infrastructure. Anonymous LLC, untraceable payment systems, documentation that looked legitimate but led nowhere. We were careful to keep everything legal. This wasn't fraud, it was theater, an expensive, elaborate piece of performance art designed to reveal truth. 2 weeks after my family had collectively abandoned me in my hour of need, I was ready to begin the second phase of my education. They'd taught me who they really were. Now it was my turn to teach them who I could be. The student was about to become the teacher, and class was about to begin. The family meeting was my idea, which should have been their first warning sign. I'd never called a family gathering in my life. I was always the one being summoned, always the one responding to their crises and celebrations. But desperation, I told them, had given me courage. "I need to see everyone," I said in individual calls to each family member. "Something incredible has happened, and I want to share it with all of you at once." The curiosity in their voices was immediate and hungry. Good news from Rachel was rare enough to be noteworthy. Good news that required a family meeting was unprecedented. We gathered at my mother's house on a Sunday afternoon in late October. The autumn light filtered through her new, expensive curtains, casting golden shadows across the living room she'd recently redecorated with money that could have helped her daughter avoid homelessness. I'd prepared carefully for this performance. Professional clothes borrowed from a colleague, a leather portfolio that looked important, and most crucially, a confidence I'd never possessed before but could now afford to buy. "Thank you all for coming," I began, standing before them as they arranged themselves on my mother's new furniture. "I know this is unusual, but what I have to share is unusual too." Mark leaned forward, his motorcycle jacket creaking. "What's going on?" "Rachel, you sounded different on the phone." "I am different," I said, allowing a smile to play at my lips. A few weeks ago, when I was facing difficulties, I was forced to look at my financial situation very carefully. I had to get creative. My father crossed his arms. I hope this isn't about asking for money again. Quite the opposite, actually. I opened my portfolio with theatrical precision. Through my work at EverTrust Mutual, I learned about an investment opportunity, something that's not available to the general public. The room's energy shifted immediately. I could see it in their posture, in the way they all unconsciously leaned closer. Money had always been their weakness, their obsession, their primary motivator. Now I was dangling it in front of them like a carrot before horses. "What kind of opportunity?" Clara asked, her voice already breathless with anticipation. Insurance companies occasionally come across unique situations, settlements that need to be funded quickly, claims that require immediate cash flow. There are investors who provide that cash in exchange for significant returns. I was improvising now, weaving together fragments of actual insurance procedures with complete fiction, but it sounded plausible, especially to people who wanted to believe. How significant? My mother's voice was sharp with interest. "We're talking about 5-to-1 returns within 6 months, sometimes better." The number hit them like electricity. I watched their faces transform, skepticism replaced by greed, caution overwhelmed by desire. 5-to-1 returns were obviously too good to be true. But greed makes people stupid, and my family had always been exceptionally susceptible to both greed and stupidity. "That sounds too good to be true," my father said, but his tone suggested he wanted to be convinced otherwise. "It would be for normal investments, but this isn't normal. We're talking about insurance settlements, court-ordered payments, situations where money absolutely must be paid. The companies need cash flow, and they're willing to pay premium rates for it." Mark was practically vibrating with excitement. "How much money are we talking about? How much can someone invest?" "The minimum is usually around $10,000 per position, but I have some influence because of my work relationship. I might be able to get people in for less." I watched them calculate, their minds racing with possibilities. $10,000 that could become $50,000 in 6 months. The mathematics of greed. "This is completely legitimate?" Clara asked. "Completely. I've seen the documentation, the legal frameworks. This is how wealthy people make money through opportunities that aren't available to everyone else." My mother was the first to bite. "How would someone get involved in something like this?" "I'd have to vouch for them personally, and it would need to happen quickly. These opportunities don't stay open long." Over the next hour, I fed them just enough information to fuel their fantasies while maintaining an air of exclusivity and urgency. I talked about confidentiality agreements, about limited positions, about the need for quick decisions. By the end of the meeting, they were all hooked. Mark wanted to invest $15,000 money he'd have to borrow, but money he was certain he could flip into $75,000. Clara and Paul were talking about $20,000, discussing whether to cash out some retirement funds. My mother and her husband Richard were considering even more, talking about liquidating some of their recent investments. "I'll need a few days to set everything up," I told them as the meeting wound down. "And remember, this has to stay completely confidential. If word gets out, the opportunity disappears for everyone." They all nodded eagerly, already spending money they didn't have on returns that didn't exist. Only Aunt Helen seemed skeptical. She'd come late to the meeting, arriving just as I was finishing my presentation. "It sounds too risky for me, dear," she said quietly. "I've never trusted anything that promises easy money. If it sounds too good to be true." "It usually is," I finished for her, smiling. "You're probably right to be cautious. Aunt Helen, this kind of investing isn't for everyone." As they all left my mother's house, buzzing with excitement and making plans for their windfalls, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. They were about to learn the same lesson they'd taught me when you really need help. The people you trust most might not be there for you. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for them to walk into it. The money came in faster than I'd expected. Within a week, My family members were transferring funds with the desperate enthusiasm of gamblers who'd convinced themselves they'd found a sure thing. Mark borrowed $18,000 against his motorcycle and his girlfriend's car. Clara and Paul liquidated their emergency savings and took a cash advance on their credit cards, scraping together $22,000. My mother and Richard were the most aggressive, pulling $35,000 from their retirement accounts, convinced they'd found their ticket to early retirement luxury. I watched the numbers accumulate in the LLC account Margaret had helped me establish. $75,000 money my family had somehow found within days for an investment opportunity. Money they'd claimed not to have when their daughter and sister faced homelessness. For 3 weeks, I played the part perfectly. I sent them periodic updates about processing delays and regulatory requirements. I created fake documentation on professional letterhead. I even had Margaret's office send them official-looking contracts to sign. Every detail was designed to maintain their excitement while building anticipation for the big payout. They called me constantly during those weeks, checking on their investments, asking about timeline updates, calculating their returns. The same people who hadn't returned my calls when I was desperate were suddenly very interested in staying in close contact. The irony was delicious and devastating. On a cold Tuesday evening in November, exactly 1 month after their investments had been submitted, I called another family meeting. This time, I suggested we meet at a restaurant neutral ground. I told them, for what I described as a celebration dinner. We gathered at Henderson's Steakhouse, the kind of upscale place my family loved to frequent when they felt flush with money. They arrived in festive moods, already planning how to spend their windfalls. Mark had been researching boats. Clara was looking at vacation packages to Europe. My mother had been browsing real estate listings for a bigger lake house. I waited until after we'd ordered, until they were relaxed and anticipatory, before I opened my briefcase and placed a stack of documents on the table. "I have news about your investments," I began. "Finally," Mark said, rubbing his hands together. "I've been waiting for this for weeks. When do we get our money?" "Well," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional, "there's been a development." The word development hung in the air like smoke. I watched their faces begin to shift from excitement to concern. "What kind of development?" my father asked. "The investment opportunity I told you about? It never existed." The silence was profound. It stretched across the table like a chasm, filled with the sound of their dreams evaporating. Clara was the first to speak. "What do you mean it never existed?" "I mean I made it up. Every detail, every document, every promise. There was no investment opportunity. There were no insurance settlements. There was no 5-to-1 return." My mother's face had gone pale. "Rachel, this isn't funny." "You're absolutely right. It isn't funny at all." I opened the top folder and began pulling out documents. "This is a test to see if any of you would help your family member when she genuinely needed it." I spread the papers across the table: bank statements, transaction records, documentation of every dollar they'd invested. 4 weeks ago, I called each of you. I told you I was facing eviction, that I needed $5,000 to avoid becoming homeless. Not one of you helped me. Not one. Mark's voice was rising. "What the hell does that have to do with—" "Everything!" I cut him off. "Mark, you found $18,000 for an investment in less than a week, but you couldn't find $5,000 to help your sister keep a roof over her head." I turned to Clara. "You and Paul found $22,000 for a get-rich-quick scheme, but helping me avoid homelessness wasn't worth discussing with your husband." My mother was staring at the documents. "Mom, you found $35,000 for an investment opportunity, but when your daughter was about to be evicted, you suggested payday loans." "Rachel, you're scaring us," Clara whispered. "Good. You should be scared, because now you know how it feels to need help from family members who don't care about your problems." My father finally found his voice. "Where is our money?" "Your money is exactly where you put it into an investment that doesn't exist, managed by people who don't care about your financial well-being." I smiled coldly. "Kind of like how my homelessness was my problem to solve. This is your problem to solve. The restaurant suddenly felt too quiet. Other diners were beginning to notice our table, sensing the tension radiating from our corner. "You can't do this," Mark said, his voice shaking with rage. "This is theft! This is fraud!" "Actually, it's education. You invested money in a business opportunity that was clearly too good to be true. You signed contracts. You made decisions. You took risks. The fact that you were motivated by greed instead of due diligence isn't my fault." I gathered the documents back into my briefcase. But here's the really beautiful part. Remember Aunt Helen, the one person in this family who actually offered to help me when I needed it? She's going to be just fine. In fact, she's going to be better than fine. I stood up from the table, looking down at their shocked faces that were beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. "You all taught me a very valuable lesson about family loyalty. Tonight, I'm returning the favor. The chaos that erupted in that restaurant was everything I'd imagined and more." Mark lunged across the table, trying to grab my briefcase. Clara started crying, loud enough that other diners turned to stare. My mother began hyperventilating, fanning herself with her napkin while Richard tried to calm her down. My father sat in stunned silence, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been respect. "You're insane!" Mark snarled as the waiter approached our table with obvious concern. "We'll sue you. We'll have you arrested. You'll do nothing," I said calmly, slipping my coat on. "Because you invested in a legal business opportunity that didn't pan out. That's capitalism. That's risk. That's the free market you all love to talk about." "Rachel, please," Clara sobbed. "We need that money. We took out loans. We cashed out our savings." "I needed help too," I replied. "But that was different, wasn't it? That was just me being irresponsible, me needing to learn a lesson about fiscal responsibility." I turned to my father, who was still sitting in shocked silence. "Isn't that right? Dad, isn't this exactly the kind of character-building experience you thought I needed?" "This is different," he said quietly. "No, this is identical. You all made poor financial decisions, and now you're facing the consequences. The only difference is that when I needed help, it was real. When you need help, it's justice." I left them there in that restaurant, their voices rising in panic and anger behind me. I drove home slowly, taking surface streets instead of the highway, letting the magnitude of what I'd just done settle over me like snow. For the first time in my adult life, I'd wielded real power. I'd stopped being reactive, stopped being the family's emergency fund, stopped accepting their treatment of me as if it were natural law. I'd shown them exactly what it felt like to be abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you. But the revenge wasn't complete yet. The next morning, I called Aunt Helen and asked if I could come visit. She welcomed me as she always did, with genuine warmth and homemade coffee. We sat in her small, tidy living room while I told her everything: the lottery ticket, the test, the fake investment, the confrontation at the restaurant. She listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or shaking her head, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "So what happens now?" she asked when I finished. "Now you get to choose what happens to you," I said, pulling out a legal document Margaret had prepared. "This is a trust fund, $100,000, managed professionally, generating enough income for you to never worry about money again." Helen's eyes widened. "Rachel, I can't accept—" "Yes, you can. You're the only person in this family who ever helped me without expecting something in return. You're the only one who offered genuine assistance when I needed it. You deserve to be taken care of." She began to cry, quiet tears of relief and gratitude. "I've been so worried about retirement, about what would happen if I got sick." "You don't have to worry anymore." We spent the rest of the morning making plans. Helen would keep working as long as she enjoyed it, but the financial pressure was gone forever. I arranged for a financial advisor to help her, for legal protection, for everything she'd need to live comfortably for the rest of her life. As for the rest of my family, I kept my word. Their money was gone. invested in a business that existed only on paper. Some of them tried to sue, but Margaret's legal work was flawless. Every document was technically legitimate, every transaction properly recorded. They'd voluntarily invested in a high-risk venture that had failed. The courts saw nothing actionable. Mark lost his motorcycle paying back the loans he'd taken. Clara and Paul had to sell their house and move into a small apartment. My mother and Richard's retirement was devastated, their dreams of luxury postponed indefinitely. My father, surprisingly, never said another word about it. Perhaps he finally understood that lectures about fiscal responsibility cut both ways. They tried calling me, of course. Angry calls, pleading calls, calls offering reconciliation if I'd just return their money. But I'd learned my lesson about family loyalty, and I'd taught them theirs. I don't owe anyone in that room anything anymore. For the first time in my adult life, I'm free from their expectations, their emergencies, their assumption that my purpose was to solve their problems while they remained oblivious to mine. The lottery ticket gave me money, but the revenge gave me something more valuable, the knowledge that I finally understand my worth, and I'm no longer willing to accept less than I deserve. Sometimes the best investment you can make is in teaching people the truth about themselves. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what you think about the choices I made. Please subscribe to hear more stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Did my family get what they deserved? Or did I go too far? I'm curious to hear your perspective on family, loyalty, and the true cost of taking people for granted.